Good afternoon. Welcome back to Studio One. One man who is deeply respected and who has millions of followers across the globe, and even his critics cannot help respecting him, is Dr. Shashi Tharoor. For all those Shashi Tharoor fans out there, we now begin Pride, Prejudice and Punditry with our eminent guests, Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Mr. Manu Pillai. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, a third-term member of Parliament for Thiruvananthapuram, is the best-selling author of 23 books, both fiction and non-fiction, besides being a former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and a former Minister of State for Human Resource Development and for External Affairs in the Government of India. He has won numerous awards, including the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman, a Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and the Crossword Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2019, Dr. Tharoor was also awarded the Sahitya Academy Award in the category of English non-fiction for his book An Era in the Darkness. He chairs Parliament's Standing Committee on Information Technology. Manu S. Pillai is the author of the critically acclaimed The Ivory Throne, Rebel Sultans and the Courtesan, The Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin. Formerly Chief of Staff to Shashi Tharoor MP, he is also a winner of the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar 2017. His essays and writings on history have appeared in Mint Lounge, The Hindu, Hindustan Times, Open, New Statesman, and other publications. Handing over the virtual mic to Mr. Manu Pillai.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this live session with Dr. Shashi Tharoor to discuss his new book, Pride, Prejudice and Punditry. It's a special privilege for me to actually host this discussion with him, because I just realized that I've known him for 10 years now. I met him as a 21-year-old in 2011 in September, and here we are 10 years later discussing this latest volume. I've frankly lost track of how many books you've written, sir, in the 10-year period. I think this is book number 21 or something. Even so, it's a 23. Even so, it's a pleasure, because I remember I was just looking at the old email, and I remember that it wasn't Shashi Tharoor, the politician, who hired me, but Shashi Tharoor, the writer, because I'd written to you with an email with practically an empty CV. I'd just written to you after my studies, and there wasn't even an internship in my CV. And you hired me because you liked the email that I sent you. So it's particularly special, therefore, to discuss your writing with you today. To begin with, how does it, 23 books in a 40-year career, and as your editor writes in the introduction, 5 million words over the last 50 odd years, that's a lot of work.
It is, and at the same time, I suppose it's one of these things where one looks back with a slight sense of surprise. You've written 4 books already, so you already had this feeling, but the first time you write a book, you have no idea whether it's ever going to be good enough, whether anyone will publish it, anyone will read it. You kind of pour everything of yourself in it. Then the second book, suddenly the question comes up, can I do it again? Can I write something that people will want to read since they want to read the first one? And then you sort of start beginning to get a greater sense of assurance. But in my case, it's compounded by something which you fortunately are not experiencing anymore, but did at the beginning of your writing career, which is the distractions of another job. I actually had to, for example, when my book Show Business, which was nice, my second novel, had the incredible honor of being reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, I was inundated with calls from agents and publishers saying, when's the next manuscript? You're going to be a star. And I had to say, sorry, I'm working on the Civil War in former Yugoslavia. No question of working on another book. And indeed, a full 3.5 years went by before I could even begin to work on another book, and 5 before I published my next one, which was India from Midnight to the Millennium. So, in other words, I have spent a lifetime of writing whenever I could, but always juggling it with professional responsibilities that, whether at the UN or in Indian politics, have had to take precedence over the actual writing.
In fact, you have a line in the book where you say, having to return to work in the morning meant I wrote at night with a will. And it again spoke to me. It was one of those sections in the book that I read, and it really spoke to me because I've seen this in action. I know it isn't an empty claim. And I'm not saying this to flatter you, but back in the day when I was working on my first book, I would sit in the office, next to your house, and I would see your study light on till 2 in the morning, for example. And at that time, I would think to myself that if he can do it after 15 odd books and a career as a UN Under Secretary General, I have no excuse. So, and that sort of comes across in this book as well, which is that there's a lot of work that you need to obviously juggle, but writing isn't something that just flows in some romanticized sense. It really is a lot of hard work, and you've somehow managed to sort of juggle it. What keeps you motivated, considering that you could easily become a bit more complacent, right? You've done all these books, you've got success in all the stereotypical ways that people imagine, and yet somehow you're willing to stay up till 2 at night and work.
Thank you, Manu. Well, I think it's George Bernard Shaw put it better than I possibly can when he said, "I write for the same reason a cow gives milk." I mean, it's inside me; it's got to come out, and in a very real sense, I'd probably be in pain or in distress if it didn't. And that's something which I think is the ultimate motivation. I would much rather not write at unreasonable hours. I'd much rather put my feet up with a good, drink and watch some cricket, or socialize with friends, or go to see a movie or whatever. But I deny myself those things, get rid of my day's work responsibilities, return those phone calls that I must, and then very often past 10:30, 11, sit down to write. And that has become now a sort of a routine in some ways. It's never entirely a routine, because a lot depends on what awaits you the next morning, how far you can tax yourself. But it's the only way for someone in my situation, and it has its challenges. It certainly meant that style of working has really made fiction writing next to impossible, and I've had to confine myself to writing interruptible prose, which is nonfiction.
And you've done a bunch of columns, and what, again, David, your editor, calls, there's a lot of transitory writing, but there's also writing that will last for very many years. But you're right. The only book I can think of where you did take time off was, of course, An Era of Darkness, where you disappeared for 12 days into the mountains of Bhutan, into a little cottage with bad internet, and we in the office in Delhi had to run around trying to get in touch with you occasionally when there was some kind of emergency or the other. But otherwise, whether it was Pax Indica, which was, I think, the first book you published after I joined your office, and there was, I think, India Shastra, Era of Darkness, of course, you disappeared into the hills, but everything else was juggled with a busy life in Parliament and even elections and all of that. It's really quite.
Darkness was a bit of a special case, because there was just so much research to be digested. I don't think I could have done justice to it in a life with too many other intrusions, because I had finally learned the art of piling things onto the laptop, onto the Google Drive and onto the laptop and so on. And I had literally, tens of thousands of pages of material, some of which I had to read, some of which I had to skim. I had entire books from the 19th century on my laptop. And there's no meaningful, efficient way in which I could have broken the back of that vast volume of material to distill some sort of coherent argument out of it, without actually just taking time off and doing nothing else. So during those 12 days in Bhutan, I worked literally 18-hour days. First thing in the morning, I even wrote at the laptop, at the computer. I didn't go to a dining table. It was just one of those things. I had promised myself I would exercise by walking for an hour every day, but unfortunately, I had developed some sort of infection on my leg. And after 1 or 2 days of walking, I went to see a doctor there who said, "Sorry, no more walking," which is a perfect excuse for me. So I could then write 18 hours a day without even getting up from the desk. Wake up, brush your teeth, and then start writing from your morning tea onwards. And that basically gave me the what I wrote in those 12 days in a white heat was only about half the published book.
Yeah.
But it gave me the structure that I wanted, the flow of the narrative, and the method of using the material that I wanted. And the result of that was that I actually then could come back, resume my normal life as an MP, politician, this and that. Fortunately, not in a terribly demanding year. There were no elections that I was directly involved in or anything at that time. And then what I did, Manu, was to flesh out bits. Sometimes what had been one chapter in Bhutan may have ended up as 2 or 2.5 chapters by the time I expanded it, but I got the book done that way. I have not been able to allow myself the luxury of that kind of break ever since. So the subsequent books have all been written in bursts and with interruptions and all that at work.
I mean, I wonder though, if you had a chance to disappear for 3 months, what you'd end up achieving with something like that, and that kind of time and that kind of space. But let's go back to the beginning for a while. Your father was a newspaperman, so I'm assuming there was some kind of exposure to the written word from him. Was he a writer, by the way? Did he write? Did he dabble with writing?
Yeah, he actually was a far more gifted wielder of words than he ever really tried to be, because he was on the managerial side of newspapers. He was the London manager first of the Statesman, then the Bombay manager of the Statesman, and then the advertisement manager of the Statesman Group, headquartered in Calcutta. So at every side he was in management. He wrote the most wonderful letters, though, and when he passed away, we were going through his papers. Some of those letters were so extraordinarily perfectly expressed that I really regret that he never did more justice to his own writing talents. Considering, too, that he was really self-taught. I mean, he went to a village school or a small town school in Kerala, and to a smallish town college thereafter, before going to England. But one knows the quality of English that is taught in village schools even today, and in those days it would have been pretty back. I found notebooks of his where he'd copied out or recited by mugging up entire passages of Byron and Shakespeare as a kind of way of teaching himself the language. And I must say that his fluency and his ability to find the right word for the right situation, whether it was a letter to a landlady, whether it was a letter to somebody who'd been bereaved, whether it was somebody he was hiring or letting go of a job, whatever, he just knew how to use language perfectly. And he loved words. He was a Scrabble addict. He would play Scrabble all the time. He would make up games for us, the kids, where he would give us a 9 or 10 letter word and then make us make smaller words of 4 letters or more out of those letters. That sort of game. He made up word games to play in cars on journeys, where he would imagine a 5-letter word and we had to guess it. Guess it by coming up with alternative words, and he would tell us how many letters in our word were present in his word, and then logical reasoning you end up with. It's a fabulous sort of thing. So I remember Dad and words all the time, but also the sense that words were not there for their own sake. They mattered, they communicated something of value to other human beings, and that's why they needed to be mastered, loved, and used. And all of that came very much from my father. And the other thing that I had was my childhood asthma. I was a very, very ill child in a time when asthma wasn't quite so pleasantly dealt with. There were no inhalers in those days. I used to be given a rather large tablet, which made my tiny heart thump away like a bass drum. And which also made it impossible to sleep, partially because when you're struggling to breathe, you can't sleep. And then the medicine was making the heart go up and down. It was quite dramatic. So from a very young age, there I was sitting up in bed all day and all night, unable to sleep and unable to breathe. And of course, there was no TV in the India I grew up in. There was no computers or mobile phones or Nintendo or any of the other distractions that today's asthmatic children, God bless them, probably have to choose from. All I had were books, and I was the eldest child in the family, so I didn't really have any elder brothers or sisters' books I could borrow. I rapidly finished. I became a very rapid reader as a young child, so I finished the books available to me, whether my own books I'd borrowed or books I'd gotten from a library, because I would finish the book in the car on the way home from the library very often. And so what did I do? I read my parents' books, whichever I could understand, and even many I couldn't understand. And I played book cricket with the fatter volumes. And when all of those options were exhausted, I did the next best thing, which was to write very derivative, very imitative kinds of writing, like the books that I was reading. So I read Enid Blyton's children's adventure stories, loved them. And so I made up the 6 solvers, like her 5 fine doubters or a famous 5. And my 6 solvers would go off to an Indian village and conduct various adventures and solve mysteries, right down to bumbling policemen, rather like in Enid Blyton stories and all of that. So that's how I began writing from that childhood. And I probably traveled longer than your question intended me to, but that's how I got a start.
It's actually a good follow-up, really, because it reminded me that once your staff was looking for something in one of your storerooms, and they dragged out this suitcase, and I happened to be passing by, and I saw that there was a bunch of old newspaper clippings from the 80s of articles that you'd written. I think relatively obscure publications now, called Gentleman's Magazine and things like that, which I don't think they've made it into this collection, because I think that was pre-internet era. And at some point, I have a feeling if your editor, David, finds out that such a collection exists somewhere in your storeroom, he's going to ransack the place and try and see if he can unearth something from there.
I feel awful, Manu. Something's happened to it all, because a publisher, not David, a rival publisher, wanted to publish my juvenilia. And I said, look, I just don't have the time. You can send an intern to go through the storeroom and see if you can find anything. And after days prowling through the storeroom, they could find nothing at all. And one of my staff said that apparently at one point we'd had an attack of termites or whatever, and perhaps lost a lot of things. I don't even know what exactly we've lost. So it may be that all my childhood scribbles are gone. I'm really sorry.
The 6 solvers won't see the light of day then, I guess.
No, it's sad, but that particular trunk never made it in my shipment from New York. So that was probably a somewhat vindictive ex-wife. So I've lost all of those early on, and then some of the clippings that survived up to here that you happen to have caught a glimpse of. We should have brought out a mobile phone and photographed them all, because now they're gone. Yeah. And Gentleman Magazine no longer exists.
Sad. But okay, coming back to the what you were talking about earlier, one of the things I've noticed is that you spoke about the influence of your father, but obviously he introduced you to reading. You picked up reading because you were stuck in bed, and I remember in one of your earlier writings you speak of how you set yourself a challenge of reading 365 books just to see, one a day, if you could just if you could do that. But the thing is, in an essay like Charles and Me, for example, there's also a sense of observation. And I wonder whether this capacity to observe things out of the ordinary comes from the fact that your parents had come from a village. They were first-generation people. They'd managed to move to London, spend a stint there. Your mother had come from a village. She picked up the English language on her own. In a sense, they were making their way in the world on their own for the first time, without family support, without any kind of privilege in that conventional sense. I mean, leaving caste privilege aside, for example. And every year you'd have to go back to the village. You'd go back to where they came from. You'd go back to a very different world. And I wonder if exposure to those kinds of different settings, where at the age of 12 you end up meeting Krishna Menon in a hospital room, but at the same time you go back to your ancestral home in Palakkad, where you're hearing stories about Tipu Sultan and lost treasure and things like that, and encountering caste over there. Do you think having this kind of diverse experiences might have perhaps, sharpened your powers of observation? Because a lot of kids I see today growing up in cities don't have exposure to rural India. They don't see things necessarily in the way your generation did. And frankly, even I did at some point.
Yeah, I think you're kind to say that and to notice it. Yeah, I mean, I would like to think that's something which I've partially allowed to atrophy, because nonfiction doesn't need so much of it. But observation of people, behaviors, social customs, patterns of speech, all of that was indeed rather important for writing credible stories in fiction. And that's why I think in many ways I was, if you like, a little more observant than perhaps otherwise would be clear. I hope you haven't disappeared. I'm not seeing you anymore.
They just put you on the screen as under the spotlight. But you've spoken about your father. I'm very curious to see how much your mother's influence played a role in your writing, because although your father was the man of words and he played these games with you and actively introduced you to books and so on, in some ways, the glimpses we get of your mother in the book is that you had a difficult relationship, but she was the one who pushed you into elocution competitions, debate competitions, all kinds of other competitive things, and sort of, I suppose, gave you a sense that success was not something you could take for granted. Talent was not something that made you special in its own right, and that you would still have to work hard no matter what. Which means that even though perhaps at that time, as you admit in the book, you didn't necessarily see her as a very friendly influence in your life, perhaps in some ways she played an important role in turning you out into the person you are, who's capable of sitting up till 2 o'clock and working even after a long day in Parliament.
Well, I think you're absolutely correct, and I think it took me a long time to realize that. Partially because my mother was in herself somebody who was chronically discontented, and when you are one of the objects of her discontent, you tend perhaps to get ultra defensive about it, and perhaps as a result, I didn't fully appreciate her drive, which I've certainly inherited. Not that my father was any less driven, but he was, I think, in some ways a little less tough. He had a heart that was very easily melted. He was a compassionate person. I can't imagine that he would have reacted to. I remember once when I think it was the only year in my entire schooling that I didn't come first in class was the 8th standard. I came third, and I came home and my mother reacted as if there'd been a death in the family. And it really, I mean, I was made to feel so lousy that here. And in many ways, when I look back on these things, it sort of makes me think that she obviously, by having high standards and by constantly expecting me to meet them, made me somebody driven to excel. But certainly I must say that today, she's mellowed a lot, and my equation with her is far better than it's ever been, because she's now living with me. Thanks to COVID, we've suddenly had these couple of years together in which, though in the old days, it was always a question of her expectations of me. Now she wants me to relax and just spend more time chatting with her, or playing cards, or playing Scrabble for that matter. She's not particularly obsessed with my political career. She's not anxious that I have to stay and continue the struggle for the next possible position. She feels essentially that I have nothing left to prove. Somehow she's planted in me the seeds that make it difficult for me to come to that same conclusion. But I can certainly no longer accuse her of being a source of pressure. In fact, she disapproved of my entering politics, and she hopes that I will quit and return to what she sees as respectability, but also, I think, to a bit of relaxation, which obviously politics doesn't give me the time to do. But Mum is now someone who's very, very close to me. There's a new kind of emotional codependence between mother and son that had all but lapsed for nearly 5 decades. And I must say that that her strength in coping with her early bereavement — my father died at 63 — her independence of mind and body, her faith in herself, and a determination to face life on her own is an extraordinary lesson. And while she's earned the right finally to relax and to take love and security for granted, including from me, I'm not sure I've earned that yet. So I'm happy to be the provider of all those for her. It's a new and joyous role for me. But equally, I must say now I'm sort of driving myself, as it were. It's not her tongue that's pushing me on.
It's funny though that you mentioned some of these things in the book as well, especially her disapproving of your entering politics. And again, I had a little giggle when I read that bit, because I remember the 2014 election campaign, which was a nasty time, in terms of the kinds of things people were saying about you and so on. And I remember we were in Trivandrum and she came into the room raised her hand in one of those namaskaram, postures, and she essentially ended up saying, "I hope he loses this election and goes back to America and to a dignified life again." Because look at the kind of things people are saying. And to me, she's always been this extremely interesting woman. And I suppose this was a time when interesting women often got branded difficult women and so on. But in reality, she seems like a very talented person. And I think when people say there's always a woman behind a man's success, in your case, I think your mother probably played a very important role, even if it wasn't obvious for a very long time.
And which I didn't acknowledge for a very long time. I think it's true. I think it's only now that I can see properly the extent of her impact on me, subconsciously as well as in practice. But the thing about my mom is she had tremendous talents, but she didn't have the staying power. So to some degree, what my sticking at the last, as it were, is partially because I saw the opposite of my mom. She was a very talented singer, good enough to get an audition to be a playback singer, but she screwed up. She was a talented painter. You may have seen in my home the Yavur painting she's done. She just stopped painting after 2 or 3 of those. She has all sorts of gifts. She started making ceramics and so on. Gave that up after a few months. She learned Robindra Sangeet when my father was posted in Calcutta. Gave that up. So the thing with my mom is multiple talents, but not the patience or the interest or whatever the word is to stick to them and keep going. Whereas I've tried, in fact, to resist any temptation to give up anything. So whenever I take something on, I doggedly stick to it. And that may be a sort of reaction to my mother as well. So she gets credit for that too.
The segment of the book which was autobiographical, where you discuss your parents, the family, and all of that, it did make me wonder, which is that even in your earlier writings, you do speak about personal experiences, personal journeys, your work in the UN and so on. But one would imagine that after 7 years in politics, perhaps revealing some of these things might not come to you very easily, which is why this was surprising. I thought, you'd put things in the book that potentially people could use against you. Even what you said just now, somebody wanting to target you can say, Shashi Tharoor, look at how he speaks about his mother, But there is still a willingness to discuss some of those very human feelings that you feel towards family members, towards your own mother, animosity, and then how it changes over time and you become friendly and how eventually you acknowledge her role in your life and so on. Did the thought never cross your mind that this kind of candor in writing can perhaps come and backfire, considering that you're in politics and people are looking for fodder that they can misuse?
Manu, it's a very good question, which it didn't occur to me, partially because when I write, I become a different person, I suppose. I don't know, that's not right. I think as a writer when I write, and I know what a good writer tries to do. Whereas when I'm in politics, it's a different world altogether. And the interesting thing is, of course, that I do straddle the worlds when I write about politics. And there I'm very conscious of the political impact of what I write. But when I write about myself or my family or personal experiences, when I write fiction, I don't think for a minute that it's got to have anything to do with my political life or with my political priorities or even opportunities for my political enemies. In fact, I had a very thoughtful letter, email from an old friend from Geneva days whom I've not seen in a dozen years or more, actually. But anyway, and he was making a very similar observation to you, that he thought that what was striking about this was the fact that that I was behaving as a writer would rather than as a politician would. And I think, thank God for that, because, I do think of politics as a profession, but writing as my life. I don't want to betray one for the other.
But do you think in some ways politics has limited certain things that you can potentially write on? Has it somehow brought about a kind of self-censorship? Do you pick themes, or does your mind now work on topics and ideas that are at some level linked to the work you currently do, which is natural because this is the world you occupy now? Even in this book, there are sections on Hinduism, and one can't help but think that it's because of the climate in the country, because in your earlier arguments in why I'm a Hindu as well, where you said that Hindutva is not Hinduism and so on. Obviously, something that's happening in your political life does make its way into your writing. And I just wonder if that leads to any kind of, I don't know, self-censorship. I mean, for example, things you could have said in the 80s even about the Congress party. Can you say that now in 2021? Do these questions play on your mind actively, or is it just...
Well, when I'm writing specifically about politics, it's impossible to escape the sense of responsibility one has as a Congress MP, and a fairly prominent and visible and audible one, and therefore somebody whose words can be, and often are, shall we say, taken out of context or blown out of proportion. So I think when I write about that, I tend to be, I'm not sure self-censorship is a word, but I said tend to be conscious that what I write must do justice to my role in the party as well. So I wouldn't, for example, dwell on bits and pieces of facts and figures where I disagree with my party, for example. Whereas if I were just a commentator or a critic or a journalist, in the interest of sort of being seen to be fair-minded, I may also criticize my party while finding positive things to say about other things. Whereas here, I've chosen not to do so. So if you want to call that self-censorship, all right, but it's also just common sense and good judgment, because I do have a role that I've got to be loyal to as well. The thing is that when I write about politics, there are two kinds of writing I've done, right? So there are the columns, which are often about immediate issues, and which I raise because obviously those are ideas relating to my immediate political preoccupations, and they're written very much as a politician who's able to write, rather than as a writer from the outside about politics. So whether it's about a specific issue that happened this week, like this week I've written an article about the startling summons by the Prime Minister's office of the Election Commission. So that's a purely political piece, and of course I'm advocating a political point of view, and at the same time I try to be enough of a writer to take a broader view of the implications of this and what it means, but that's the kind of thing it is. Whereas, say, if I write a book like The Paradoxical Prime Minister, it's a political book, but it's not quite the same thing. There has to be something writerly about it, and there is a whole sort of potted description of an analysis of the Prime Minister's life, Narendra Modi's life and career, which goes on for the first 70 or 80 pages of the book. That is as much the work of an author as it is that of a politician, arguably much less that of a politician. So it goes. Some of my political writing that I did before I came into politics can, in my view, still stand the test of time. I found, for example, in digging this up, an essay on Mrs. Gandhi and the whole issue of her Indianness, which was actually written in the late 90s from the outside as somebody observing Indian politics from far away, a good decade before I even came into Indian politics. So it's not that I've been fundamentally different when I was quote unquote freer. It's still the same person with the same worldview and the same set of values through which I'm seeing that worldview. But you're right, the obligations of a president of a particular job impose certain restraints, but that's about it.
And I also ask because I've seen you operate in your constituency. I've seen you in Delhi. I've seen you in all kinds of settings. And one of the things I've noticed is that you deal with so many people, all kinds of issues. Whether it's a maid from Kerala who's been enslaved in Dubai, and you need to sort of help bring this person back and essentially save them, or it's dealing with some very high profile actor. It could be any kind of situation. And it keeps, while I was reading the book as well, and you have a section on, your ex-boss at the UN, for example, and I kept thinking that, all these people you're observing, all these political experiences you're having in the present, while, you may do a certain kind of writing, you may need to sort of make sure that, you don't cross certain rekhas and so on. At some point in the future, would you ever write some kind of book where you talk about these experiences? I don't mean an autobiography, but biographical account, but really something where, just the kinds of people you've met, the comical, the tragic, the all kinds, the whole spectrum really. There's so much there, because you've now in the last decade and more than a decade that you've been in Indian politics, just the range of experiences is so large that at some point I think you'll have material for either fiction because you observe so many people, or really a kind of non-fiction where you reveal your, I don't know, stint in politics, or your long set of years in politics, or something like that.
Thanks, Manu. Well, that latter would only be possible, I think, if I quit, because there will be a temptation at one point. In any case, I'm not somebody who wants to see himself struggling past my use-by date or expired shelf life, as it were. So I imagine the time will come when I will do namaskar and pranam to the political world and push off and just write for my declining years. But I'm not there yet, so I couldn't contemplate this yet. One thought definitely is fiction, because then you can at least avoid hurting people who are still alive if you want to portray them in a certain way. And you don't really have to hurt anyone if you merge characteristics that belong to 2 or 3 people and create a fictional character who embodies some of these things. Then it's easier to do. So I think I am tempted. I've been approached by multiple publishers for an autobiography, and I've resolutely said no all along. Partially because, no doubt, my mother's discontent is still there, and I don't feel accomplished enough to make a biography worth writing. Though they stoutly refuse to agree with that, but still, I mean, that remains my position. But a novel with elements of if not biography, but elements of my experiences is not to be ruled out. I have a historic novel bubbling away in my head that I've not written either. So there are other projects, but I really do want to go back to fiction, which I find very difficult to do as a looks of INP, because when you're in this life, I mean, you write wonderful non-fiction, but you haven't, I think, yet tried your hand at creating a non-existent universe, an alternative moral universe in your head, and populating it with characters, episodes, lines of dialogue, incidents that are as real to you as anything you're encountering in your daily life. Now, to do that, you're constructing the sort of artificial glass palace of illusion that you can inhabit every day when you're writing the book. But if you keep having to exit it suddenly because somebody's called from the constituency, or a politician shown up, or you've got to rush off to Parliament when you're in the middle of your most creative phase, or you've got to suddenly go off and go and campaign in a by-election, or whatever it may be, all those interruptions start bringing cracks into that glass, and eventually at some point the glass gets shattered. So my laptops are littered with half-completed, not even half-completed, half-begun fictional manuscripts in the first decade of the century, until I finally said, this clearly isn't working. If I write fiction, I know that even if it's interrupted for weeks on end, I can go back, read what I've written so far, pick up the thread of what I was thinking, and continue the argument. With nonfiction, with fiction, I can't do that. With nonfiction, I can. And so what I want to do now, I think, is while I'm in politics, I'll produce 1 or 2 more works of nonfiction. And then I will resolutely tell myself, I must go back and do this. When I wrote the Great Indian Novel and Show Business, I was a relatively junior or mid-level official at the UN. And so I wasn't the guy who was getting the midnight calls. So I would come back from a long day's work and then pretty much write from 8 to midnight every night. So I could inhabit that alternative world I was creating in my fiction. And in fact, with Show Business, I remember my wife and kids weren't with me for a good chunk of the time. I literally wrote every Saturday and Sunday for 18 hours each day, and then 2 or 3 hours every evening. And it was I finished the whole book in 6 months. So it can be done, but it can't be done, I think, if you're a Lok Sabha politician.
Which, and the mention of fiction and the Great Indian Novel brings me to that question, which is, let's talk about the first book, really. I know Reasons of State was your first publication. It was your thesis that was turned into a book. But as David also acknowledges in the introduction to this book, it was a Great Indian Novel that shot you to prominence. He met you. I didn't know that he'd met you as a 25-year-old, which is 40 years ago, I imagine, and that you guys had known each other for that long. And then a few years later, you sent him this manuscript, a typed up manuscript, and he thought it was an amazing book, and it is. It remains my favorite book of all the books that you've written. The Great Indian Novel, I think, is right there at the top. How did that happen? How did you come up with the idea? What led to the great Indian novel? This is from 1989. So I'm assuming
Right.
somewhere in the mid 80s, you decided to sit down and do this book. And,
Absolutely.
just tell us the story of how the book came to be.
Okay. And just to correct David, he's actually off by a year. We met in 1980, I think, when he joined Gentleman magazine as a managing editor, and I had a monthly column in that magazine. So
okay.
that's when Gentleman was trying to be the Indian Esquire. It was founded by Minhas Merchant, who has now become known for other kinds of writing, but he and then he hired David as his managing editor, and I was a columnist, so I met him there, and we kept. That was 24 then. But anyway, the fact is that the Great Indian Novel came about because of an epiphany when I turned 30 in 1986, and I realized that I'd accomplished absolutely nothing with the pen or with the keyboard after having been considered in my teens to be a bit of an authorial prodigy or a talented writer, because I was published extensively in every Indian magazine in the English language, probably from Chandamama to Eve's Weekly, from the Illustrated Weekly to JS. I mean, I appeared everywhere. And therefore I had, if you like, there were some expectations that I'd be a breakthrough writer, and then I wasn't, and there I was, for example, when I was stationed in Singapore in the latter part of my 20s, working for the UN. I would occasionally write book reviews and culture type pieces. I couldn't write politics, obviously, as a UN official, but I would write book reviews and so on for the Straits Times of Singapore. And I remember reviewing the great Rushdie's Midnight's Children and calling it the Great Indian Novel in my review of the Straits Times. So having reviewed and seeing through the works of people like Rushdie, how much potential there was in the Indian experience to be mined in good quality fiction, must have played away at the back of my mind. I was then reading sometime in later that year of 1986 or early 87, Pilal's Mahabharat, his transcreation, as he called it, the Mahabharat. And I was struck by the immediacy of the writing, the sense that it was such a lively, almost contemporary sounding tale. Obviously, it was set many centuries. So I started reading more about the Mahabharata, how it had been told and retold for 800 years. But we kind of stopped the retelling around 400 AD, and was the various recessions of those 800 years of versions, but there wasn't any retelling. And then I idly asked myself the question, if we were retelling the Mahabharata today, because the great events of those times were all shoved into the narrative of the Mahabharata, what would we write about today? And I thought, obviously, the freedom struggle. And as a student of history, I was fascinated by that period as well anyway. So I thought, why not have a crack at this? So I actually sat down, just for the hell of it, and started writing a story that would meld the Mahabharata episodes and characters into a satirical retelling of the freedom struggle. I didn't want to be straight hagiographical stuff or too reverential. Why would anyone want to read that? So I wanted to be original and satirical. There wasn't, at that point, to the best of my knowledge, any well-known Indian satirical novel. So I thought, let's go have a crack at this. But I just, had no idea. I had no plan. I had no schematic. I hadn't worked out how the translation from past to present, etc., would work, what the episodes would be. I just wrote. And I remember I'd written about 32 pages, set it aside. I had fun writing it, didn't think about it. Again, my brother-in-law came visiting. And he sat there in an easy chair one evening when I was at my computer writing something else. And I saw in the corner of my eye he was reading. And he was obviously fascinated. And he kept reading page after page after page. And when he got to the last page, he turned, couldn't find any more. And he turned to me and said, "Where's the rest of this?" And I said, "There isn't any. I just wrote that much." He said, "You're crazy. This is fabulous. You have to continue." And that kind of inspired me. And then I wrote 100 pages and sent them off to an agent. In fact, sent them off to 2 agents in the UK, both of whom reacted very favorably. So that encouraged me. And then I wrote the rest. And what was interesting was how foolhardy the whole enterprise was. I mean, I must have devoted hours and hours at night and weekends to a book that I didn't know how the damn thing was going to evolve. And when I get, for example, to the independence era, I had to suddenly turn the characters into walking metaphors because it was no longer possible to find direct correlation. So the five Pandavas, for example, whereas you could say that the Gandhiji character was Ganga Datta, another name for Bhishma, the gift of the Ganga, or that Dhritarashtra was very evidently Nehru, and so on. What you do when you come to independence, and you can't have one person from each of the Pandavas corresponding to one character in contemporary Indian politics. So instead, I made them symbols. So Bhim became effectively the army, and Arjun became the free media, and Nakul and Sahadev became the foreign service and the domestic administrative service, and so on. And these things required a sort of almost a breathtaking sort of leap into the unknown, including deciding to turn Draupadi into a symbol of Indian democracy. So she is then she is the illegitimate offspring of a liaison between the first prime minister and the last viceroy. So that is the British Indian miscegenation, and is adopted by a low-caste servant called Mokrasi. So she's Draupadi Mokrasi. Now, you couldn't get more unsubtle than that. That was, and then everything that happens to Indian democracy, including the emergency, which in my novel is called The Siege, happens to her. And the emergency is the disrobing of democracy, and therefore the disrobing of Draupadi. And believe me, Manu, I'd never sat and plotted any of this. It all occurred to me as I was writing, which is why I felt something almost magical about the composition of that book, as if I was dipping into some sort of stream of creativity and consciousness somewhere else. It was just coming to me while I was writing. It was one of the most exhilarating experiences of my life. And when I finished it, and I gave it the shape of the 18 books to make it the 18 parvas and so on, I sent it off to this agent in the UK. Little did I realize that 40 years later, I'd be talking to you about it, and a time when people who weren't born when the book was written, including you, are reading it now. And that's been amazingly satisfying. So I wrote it from, I would say, roughly a year and a half between mid-87 and late 88. It was accepted by Viking Penguin in the UK in late 88, just as the troubles were starting I mean, Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses came out, I think the week after I had signed my contract with Viking Penguin, and therefore I was gifted one of the first copies off the press. That was the timing that sits in my head. And then, because I was stubborn enough to remember my own student days of not being able to afford foreign editions of books, I said, I would like to give you the world rights except for India, because I want there to be an affordable Indian edition. And they said, fine. So the contract was signed. And then by a miracle, that was the time that Penguin decided to start an Indian press. And David Davida was hired to run it. So I actually, it was quite coincidental that Viking Penguin England and Penguin India both published the book, because I would have sent it to David even if my English publisher had been someone else. But the first publication actually was the first selection of the book for publication was by a British publisher. And I always enjoyed reading a line from the book in which a bumptious colonial character tells his aide, basic truth about the colonies, he's loved. Too many of the wrong sorts of books getting into the hands of the wrong sorts of people. If ever the British Empire comes to ruin, he's like, mark my words, the British publisher will be to blame. So I enjoyed inflicting those lines on the British reading public.
It's a delightful book. In fact, practically every page has some gem of the other, which is why I keep wondering if you ever get a chunk of time, say a year, to get away and just write. I really do wonder what you'll be able to produce. But I must ask you, you mentioned to me years and years ago a book called Ramayana Retold by Aubrey Menon, which was my introduction to Aubrey Menon. And had you read this book at that time? Because to me, in some ways, it looks like his is an irreverent take on the Ramayana. Yours is on the Mahabharata, and it's quite interesting that I wonder if there was any kind of inspiration from there.
Because the book was banned, Manu. So what happened was that I had read a very short excerpt in an anthology, and that's how I knew about Rama Retold. It was a rationalist retelling of the Agni Pariksha. Yeah. So in Aubrey Menon's retelling, as I remember, and this is now 40 plus years ago, in that anthology, and I've even forgotten whose anthology it was, of writings about India, writings by Indians. It was instead of Sita actually going through an Agni Pariksha, in Aubrey Menon's retelling, Rama and she cook up a deal where he puts some sort of thing that's igniting around so people see the flames, but inside it's not, and she goes through a trap door and escapes, kind of thing, which was very clever, I suppose, but I also thought was a bit irreverent. But when I looked for the book, I was told it's banned in India, and I couldn't find it anywhere. And of course, long since out of print everywhere in the West. Now, much later, when I had the means, I did acquire a copy through a beneficent friend, but I haven't since found the time to read it, and I don't even know where the blessed book is now in my shelves. So anyway, but it was not an influence other than the fact that I knew it existed, and nor was the Jean-Claude Carrière script for Peter Brook's Mahabharata, which also by coincidence had taken the world by storm in the mid-80s. I found that at a used bookshop in Tottenham Court Road or something in England when I was in England for the publication of my book. And I picked it up and read it. And I was secretly very relieved that he had chosen many of the same episodes that I felt were essential to unraveling the story of the Mahabharata.
Yeah, I mean, I picked up Aubrey Menon's book in London at the British Library after you told me about it. And, while he's irreverent, and it's an irreverent retelling of the Ramayana, and yours is not a retelling of the Mahabharata. You've taken the Mahabharata template and essentially brought 20th century Indian politics into it. But, the reading of the Mahabharata, you've got, extracts from your fiction as well in this new book. That was another question I had, which is that this engagement with Indian writing, traditional Indian writing, traditional Indian scripture, even, Indian religious thought, has that been a part of your life, from the very beginning? Because I remember when you wrote Why I'm a Hindu, a number of people said that, this is like Congress people discovering their religious credentials because the BJP's made religion such a big thing, which to me seemed a bit odd, because I do remember that, I'd never seen you pray as such, except occasionally, but I do remember your house is full of Ganeshas. Your study has a ton of Ganeshas. You've got Ganeshas. Yeah, you've got a ton of gods all over the place, which to me suggested that no, it wasn't as though the Hinduism was suddenly, it came out of nowhere. It was probably there for a longer time.
No, it's there throughout. My parents were quite devout, and I remember childhood pilgrimages to all the temples in the south and things like that, which and also dialogue with Dad about the religion, which I've recounted in part in Why I'm a Hindu. And in fact, I was very influenced by the Hindu philosophy I read in the English language. I'm not pretending to be a Sanskrit scholar of any sort, but I did pray daily, and I did find Hinduism intellectually fascinating. And even in India from midnight to the millennium, which is a dozen years before I entered politics, and 20 years almost before I wrote Why I'm a Hindu, I have a few pages of my personal Hinduism in the context of the larger arguments in those days about Ram Janmabhoomi and so on, which are there in that book, 24 years old. So to suggest that I sort of discovered my Hinduism through reacting to the BJP is silly, because it shows that the long paper trail of evidence to the contrary has not been paid attention to. But I will confess that I was very much part of that school of thought that treated religion as something intensely personal. You wouldn't have seen me praying because I wouldn't have felt it appropriate to pray in front of you. I have a puja room in the house, or a puja alcove, depending. In the house in Delhi, it's a room, and in Trivandrum, it's only one corner of the living room because it's a smaller flat. And I pray, and I pray every day that I'm here, and I'm attached to certain religious symbols, and as you say, we have over 100 Ganesh statues all over the house, and I have no trouble with any of that. I've also read an awful lot of books about Hinduism in order to understand it through the eyes of scholars, observers, and so on. And I felt I've learned a lot, and I know what I personally liked about the faith. So when the BJP started thrusting a very different view of Hinduism down the throats of Indians, I began to think this isn't right. I mean, I, for example, had been a huge Vivekananda devotee from my college days. And in Delhi University, there used to be, I don't know if there still is, but there was an annual Swami Vivekananda Memorial Lecture. And I was the youngest one in my third year in college. I was invited to deliver that lecture, and I did. And so, I had my own views. I've probably read everything Vivekananda ever said because he said it in English, and it was therefore, for me, much more accessible. And my view of Hinduism was very much shaped by his, plus, of course, by subsequent thinkers, Gandhiji and his modern interpretations of the faith have all influenced me. Though I recognize the most explicitly Christian influences on Gandhiji's thinking, but I know where the Hindu philosophy comes from. So because I've thought about all this and read about all this, when the BJP was doing this, yes, the timing of writing Why I'm a Hindu was influenced by the fact that I felt a certain moral urgency to hit back at this distorted view of my faith, which is not my experience of the faith that I had grown up with, and that's why I was able to talk about it the way I did.
No, actually, I have seen you pray, which was entirely by accident, because sometimes we'd be running late for meetings, and I'd try to sort of come and sort of urge you to get out of the room or something, and I'd see that I'd interrupted your prayer. We're running out of time, so I'll just ask one more question, which is linked to another section in the book, which was on cricket. I'm not a cricket fan, so I really can't claim I have too many questions. But again, it brought back a memory from the 2014 elections where it was tough. Everybody was up at 4 a.m, running around, surviving on oranges and fruit because, we were on the move all the time. But I do remember every now and then, even if it was in a shop that you entered and the TV screen was on and some match was playing, you would stop for like a 2 whole minute break over there and try and follow what was happening, and had to be pulled away from there to get back onto the campaign trail, which is when I realized that when people say that some people have cricket mania, it isn't an exaggeration in your case. You clearly do have
That's
some
right.
kind of great affinity for cricket.
I'm what the Australians call a cricket tragic. And it really is, for me, a bit of an obsession. In fact, in my earlier days, even in politics, I would sometimes stop the car in the middle of a busy campaign if I saw a bunch of kids playing cricket somewhere and join them, and at least bowl a ball or whack one for a couple of minutes, just to sort of enjoy that thrill all over again. I think I finally may have outgrown that, but I certainly enjoyed doing that. Manu, is one of these things where I believe that human beings. I'm one of these people for whom the mind matters more than the physical body. I mean, I live by what my mind can process, what my mind can imagine, what my mind can reproduce through words, and so on. But I have weaknesses, and I think one should be allowed to indulge a few of them, whether it's idlis or chocolate or cricket, and I would very happily acknowledge that it is for me a bit of a weakness, in that at a time when I'm really busy and have deadlines to meet, you will find me sneaking a look at the very least at the updated cricket scores on the internet, or if something really exciting is happening according to the internet, might even rush off from my seat to catch a glimpse of it on TV, to come back, and so on. So that's part of who I am. The essays in this book, of course, are there not so much for the cricket fan per se, but they're supposed to be relatively reasonable examples of good writing. I hope that you will agree, despite not being a cricket fan.
I do. Yeah. No, I do. And, I again, reminds me that you have your domestic staff record matches that you're missing because, you were in Parliament or you were out somewhere for a meeting or something. And it always, in a sense, was very endearing, because in a sense, you could almost see that this great man who's achieved all these wonderful things in life also has this very human side. So the cricket is, in that sense, though I'm not a cricket fan, it's a very sweet thing to see, even in this book and in general in your life. And since we only have 2 minutes left, or a minute left, I'll just end by asking you a question I suppose one must ask all authors and writers is, what are you reading at the moment? I know you've just put out this book, but what are you reading at the moment?
Well, this will undoubtedly amuse you, because I have a certain book called False Allies open right now by Manu Pillai. But on my last flight, because it was too heavy to carry, I began a political thriller by Seema Goswami called Racecourse Road. And I must say, I've only read 85 pages, but I was totally caught up in it. And she's already published a sequel. This one was, I think, published 2 years ago, and I had a copy then, but I had a tragedy last year when termites ate up about 800 of my books, or not quite as many as that, but about 200 of my books, or 250, including all my Nehrus and so on, all consumed by termites. And one of the victims of the termite assault it was clearly parked in the wrong place, was Seema's Racecourse Road. So she very graciously sent me a new copy, and I took it with me on the flight. And it's really amusing because in some way she's writing about a world I know from the inside, and she does so from the outside with a compelling level of research and detail. So I'm looking forward to the rest of it on my next long flight. I only ever read on flights these days.
I think that the sequel is called Madam Prime Minister. Anyway, thank you, sir. This was a pleasure to really catch up in some sense and also discuss your work. To the viewers, this is the book, Pride, Prejudice and Punditry. Do pick up a copy. And it's a keeper. You can read it. You can dip into it whenever you like. There are short essays. And how many in total? I don't know. I didn't count the total. There you go.
75 excerpts and essays. Yeah.
There you go. Thank you, sir. And thank you to the viewers.
Thank you so much. What are you working on next?
Nothing. I just have to finish my PhD thesis now.
You have finished or you're about to?
No, I've got 6-7 more months to do that.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Looking forward to calling you Dr. Pillai before too long.
Thanks.
All the very best. Thank you.
It was such an interesting conversation. We were all delighted to listen to Dr. Tharoor as usual. Thank you, Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Mr. Manu Pillai for being our PILF guests. After a 15-minute break at 1:45 p.m., we will begin our next interesting discussion, slipping between the crevices of words, drawing the fine line, a discussion on translation.